Turkey is a country at the crossroads, but what will that mean for its economy? Just days before the July 15th coup attempt, I caught up with Daron Acemoglu, one of the world's top economists and a Turkish national. Now, Turkey is growing, and Turkey has been growing. What has driven the economic growth, and is it a sustainable model?
Well, I think Turkey has grown on and off for most of its existence. It started as a poor country and it grew into the sort of the ranks of lower middle income countries, halfway into the 20th century. But its growth has not always been of the same quality and of the same health. And I do distinguish between two periods of economic growth in the recent past. The first one, roughly speaking, from 2002 to 2006, when the AKP first came to power. This was growth of much higher quality. You see, it was fueled by investment. It was driven by productivity growth, especially multi-factor or total factor productivity, meaning that both the capital and the labor that was being employed was becoming more productive, and that's mostly because you had inefficiencies being avoided and new, better companies coming in and stealing business from less efficient ones, and new technologies being deployed. You had this economic growth took place for about 5 years at rates that were pretty unusual for Turkey for such, extended periods of time, as fast as any other 5-year period you've seen. You had this sort of economic growth taking place while inflation was low, while current account deficit wasn't ballooning, while the government deficit wasn't increasing. In fact, government's fiscal position was being consolidated and improving over this period. Since then, since about 2007 onwards, of course, we've had global recessions and its ramifications in Turkey. But what we have seen is a very different type of growth. It's a credit consumption-led, government-supported economic growth fueled by current account deficits, which feed into consumption. And you have very little private investment. You have zero or negative productivity growth. You have, in many sectors, sort of an unsustainable credit-led economic growth. And, the overall picture that emerges is that this is the type of growth that neither will last, nor will it really help Turkey go to the next stage of economic development.
And do you think Erdogan's popularity stems from his ability to push that short-term growth, or is it more reaction in favor of populism, conservative populism? What is driving?
I think that's an excellent question, and I don't think it has a single answer. But let me try to give it some of the possible factors that I think are important. So I think to answer that, it will be useful to go back and say, at least my view as to why 2002, 2006 was such healthy growth that then sort of fizzled out. And I think the story is a very institutional one. In the aftermath of the financial crisis that Turkey suffered 2001 and AKP's rise to power, there were a whole slew of institutional reforms that strengthened both the microeconomic and the macroeconomic outlook in Turkey. Macroeconomic-wise, we had inflation being brought under control, the fiscal situation being consolidated, and much greater transparency introduced into government accounts, discretion being taken away for lots of really wasteful and questionable spending from ministers into independent agencies and clearly audited practices. Microeconomically, you had both much better regulations in the labor market, in the procurement process, which became transparent and more competitive, in the foreign direct investment, both legally we became much more transparent and open, and also sort of became much more attractive for sort of many companies to partner up with foreign companies. And equally importantly, during this period, you had increased spending, particularly directed at the poorer segments of society, especially those in the urban poor, which increased their educational attainment, which increased their infrastructural access, health situation. And all of these, of course, translate into better economic participation. So you have part of that economic growth being driven by companies feeling bolder in terms of their investments. Why? Because the macroeconomic situations was better. They were able to import technology in terms of joint partnerships because their partners were willing to come in. You had companies having access to better qualified workers because young people were graduating with higher quality education. And you have the rise of these Anatolian Tigers, which come from every part of the country and are bringing fresh blood, fresh products, fresh ideas. And all of these are contributors to that productivity improvements. But all of these things start changing because once the AKP takes control of the government, then they start rolling back. For instance, the procurement law is a case in point. The greater transparency is sort of rolled back, and then we go back to the old ways of doing business. So, that's sort of the story. And what are you seeing in terms of the support for the AKP? I think you're seeing both sides of this. So the first one is that many of those areas that were the main beneficiaries of both the direct and the indirect policies of the AKP are the heartlands of the AKP support. So those are the people who benefited from the health spending the AKP undertook. Educational quality improvements, educational access, infrastructure. These were the people that were entirely left aside by the previous governments. They are also the indirect beneficiaries because rapid economic growth increased wages. So inequality declined as a result of that, both because of educational access but also, I think most importantly, because of the sort of rapid economic growth. Again, they were the beneficiaries of that. So I think that created a support heartland. But then after this high quality growth comes to an end, especially over the last 5-6 years, the AKP has started sort of pursuing these populist policies, still redirecting resources to some of its sort of core support areas, and that still sort of buys it or sort of helps it maintain the support that it had gained early on. So I don't think it is a surprise that the AKP still gets 45% of the vote, even sometimes close to 50% of the vote.
You mentioned the Anatolian Tigers.
Mm-hmm.
Who are they, and what makes them successful, and are they ready to be globally competitive? Are they already globally competitive?
Some of them are. I mean, these are essentially the Anatolian Tigers refer to companies that come from sort of provincial cities of Anatolia. These are, cities that have, some of them have a couple of millions of inhabitants, but they were not very much on the economic map. Again, part of it is because it's a combination of they did not have access to infrastructure. They were not, the type of businesses that were cultivated and supported by previous governments. They were explicitly or implicitly left out of procurements or government support. And they also were not emboldened. And all of these things changed with the AKP government. AKP spoke for them. Early on, AKP was sort of likened to a an Islamic Calvinist, sort of speaking for small businesses, and these were the small businesses. The opening up of the procurement process really helped these companies, and improvements in the quality of the labor force in those provincial cities helped these companies. The fact that Erdogan, spoke as their advocate, made them bolder, take them more risks, and enter into new businesses and new markets, and all of these helped them. So I think many of them have already become global companies, or few of them have become already global companies. They were the ones who were previously disadvantaged by a procurement process that was corrupt and based on favoritism. But now that the transparency of the procurement process has been rolled back, they are the ones often that benefit from lack of transparency in the procurement process. So now some of them have become as powerful as the sort of the big politically favored companies of old days.
I think it's safe to say that Turkey doesn't have the most fantastic history of treating well the minorities in the country. You look at the Armenians have been a long-standing issue, same with the Kurds. To what extent does that inability to integrate these communities hurt economic growth?
I mean, of course it does greatly. I mean, Turkey is a multi-ethnic country, but it doesn't admit it. The Kurdish population of the country, I think, in that part of in those cities, did not really actively take part in economic activity. Kurdish migrants in other cities have been much more active, and that sort of, I think, generally reflects the fact that, lack of infrastructure, lack of opportunities in the southeast of the country. And that, for any country, large swathes of the land or large parts of the population don't gainfully take part in economic activity is just going to be a huge disadvantage. And the situation for other minorities in some sense is as bad, but they're not, they're not very numerous. There are not that many Armenians left in Turkey, so that's not going to have as much of an effect. But the overall sort of unwillingness to come to grips with this sort of multi-ethnicity has, of course, characterized much of the Republican period.
What would ascension to the EU mean for the Turkish economy?
Well, a lot. I mean, a lot. But for a variety of different reasons. So, think of two economic blocks. One is the Russian free economic zone. Nobody thinks, Armenia or, Belarus being part of that is going to be revolutionary for those countries. The other one is the European Union, where, we have witnessed Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, their accession have been absolutely transformative for these economies. What's the difference? The difference is that in the latter case, that was an impetus for economic and political institutional reform. It was the carrot of European accession that made all of these countries get their political system much more democratic, and firmly so, with the supporting institutions, free media, civil rights, civil society, and their economic institutions in order, harmonize the laws, open up the regulations in the right way, to reform the judiciary system, and so on. And that was really the transformative aspect of it. I think the right deal for Turkey would be equally transformative, mostly not because of access to the European market, that's important, but mostly because it will help anchor Turkish institutions in a way that nothing else has been able to. And that's what we sort of witnessed in the early 2000s. I didn't get into the details of what were the sort of factors that made all of the institutional reforms. I mentioned the World Bank and the IMF, but actually the EU accession process was an equally powerful factor. IMF and the World Bank pressure after the financial crisis helped with the economic institutions. But the political and the judiciary system started its reform, especially because of the EU accession platform.
Think AKP has lost, or Erdogan in particular, has lost interest in Europe, in joining the EU, I should say more specifically?
I think, yes. Early on, one important factor for the AKP was that they wanted to do anything that would weaken the military. And the military was against the European accession, especially on the terms that were on offer, because it had, rights for the Kurdish minority, reduced role of the military, judiciary independence, free media, and so on. And the AKP viewed, the Turkish EU relations as a bulwark against military sort of interference. But when it itself became the unrivaled power, then many of the things that the EU wanted started appearing as constraints on its power. So I think there was a mutual falling out. It must be said, Europe did not handle it very well and pushed Turkey away. Not that I disagree with Europe's concerns at the time, especially on human rights and speed of reforms and so on and so forth. But it was definitely badly handled, especially big shifts in France and Germany in public opinion that was sort of very badly felt in Turkey. But all of those things made Erdogan turn away from the deal that was on offer right now. Right then. Right now, they're seeking a new deal, but the question is the devil's in the details. So if Turkey, under its current problematic institutional path, gets a free pass from European Union because it's cooperating on the migrant issue, I don't think that's the same thing as the EU accession policy or process, bringing its institutional dynamics in check.
Is Turkey an example of a middle income trap, and can countries get out of the middle income trap?
Well, I think the evidence of a middle income trap as such is very weak. There are many challenges that middle income countries face, and that's for real. The way that I sort of like to think about it is that there's a middle income institutional trap, meaning that countries that have reached the middle income with a certain institutional setup, which is broadly extractive and not fully democratic and not fully open, have a real hard time reforming their institutions. And that's the trap part. Their growth might continue a little while longer and so on and so forth. That's why the middle income trap per se is not as strong if you look at the data. And I think Turkey is very much there. If you look at certain aspects of Turkish institutions, they're very modern. If you look at, if you go to Istanbul, you have, the latest technology. You have companies that are totally integrated into the world economy. But on the other hand, as we've already talked about, you have lack of free media, very weak civil society, non-independent judiciary, bureaucracy that's very politicized, and all of these things are very, very difficult to reform, and that's the trap part that, is not impossible to escape, but it requires hard work.
Well, let's hope for the best. Dr. Acemoglu, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, thank you.